for him to turn this campaign.
Oh, he's been terrific.
Yes, I know, and
I really appreciate you helping us.
Nancy Ossie, International Medical.
very happy to see you. How are
Tim
you doing?
Reeser.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
Yeah. Yeah. Again.
Might as well get out of the way here.
I don't think somebody likes us.
If the crisis in Somalia has taught us something about the worst that human beings can do to one another, it has also taught us something about the very best that human beings can do for one another. We're here today to honor one of the organizations that has been a leader in the U.S. humanitarian assistance response in Somalia, the International Medical Corps, and also to assist them in continuing their work in Somalia. The purpose of this ceremony is to sign a $1.3 million grant from the U.S. Agency for International Development to the International Medical Corps. The participants in the signing ceremony will be, in the order in which they will make brief remarks, Andrew Natsios, Assistant Administrator for Food and Humanitarian Assistance at the U.S. Agency for International Development, Senator Paul Simon, the Chairman of the African Affairs Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who has been a strong and continuing supporter of our efforts in Somalia, Senator Nancy Kassebaum, Ranking Minority Member of the African Affairs Subcommittee, who recently returned from a trip to Somalia and also has been a strong and outspoken supporter of our efforts, and Nancy Ossie, who's the President of International Medical Corps. I want to ask Andrew to begin the brief remarks, then we'll have the signing ceremony at the table behind us.
Nancy Ossie, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, and I first met when we both traveled together to begin the negotiations on the relief effort that we started in Angola during the Angolan Civil War 2 years ago. She and I drove through minefields together with members of her staff and members of my staff, and it was a rough ride, but we got the relief effort started and stopped a lot of needless bloodshed and death in the famine and in the Civil War. So we've had a relationship that goes back at least 2 years in OFDA, and I must say we were very pleased with their work there, and even greater and even more pleased with the work they've been doing in Somalia under even more difficult conditions. Their work has been truly heroic there. At the height of the civil conflict last year, they were treating as many as 100 to 150 casualty victims in Mogadishu in scenes that were reminiscent of the American Civil War. Their own staff members have been shot at. I know their doctors and nurses have been operating in many of the wards, if you can call them wards, in the hospitals in Mogadishu at gunpoint, since when parents bring their kids in to be operated on, they want them treated first, and the way they got head of line is they took the gun out. And so their doctors and their nurses operated the most difficult circumstances you can possibly imagine, and yet they're all still there working. And so we're here to not only sign this agreement, but to compliment them and thank them for the extraordinary work they've been doing, saving a lot of people's lives. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
I am pleased to be here and to see the check signed, and we thank you and your organization for your remarkable leadership. Let me also pay tribute to my colleague, Senator Kassebaum. Frankly, there is no political mileage in Kansas or in any other state for paying much of attention to the African scene. And she has just been a remarkable supporter in this area. Finally, I would add, I hope there can be, on the part of all of us, more of a sense of urgency about doing something. I'm pleased to be here at this ceremony. But we are not talking about a situation like Bosnia where it requires 400,000 troops in there to stabilize the situation. The resolution introduced by Senator Kassebaum, which I was pleased to co-sponsor, calling for security, enough security to get the food in to the people who so desperately need it, seems to me to be a minimal kind of effort that we ought to make. I hope we can make that effort. I hope in a bipartisan way we can move ahead. We are grateful to you, Jim, for going over and being there. I hope you can convey to all of us what needs to be done. But I think what all of us have to do is to get this sense of emergency. You saw it in the Washington Post story today. New York Times has it yesterday and the day before, in the Los Angeles Times were some gripping stories about what is happening over there. We just cannot be indifferent to this and call ourselves humane. That's the reality. And so I'm honored to be here for this, but I have a sense that we have to do much, much more.
Just to briefly add my admiration for the work being done by the Office of Disaster Assistance. I think that it has stepped front and center to try and help provide assistance, to understand the situation, to be a part of moving it forward. I was so very impressed with the IMC, and that's why I was so glad to be able to take part just in a small way today to help sign the check. No, I don't even get to do that, do I? Hand the check over. And to speak about the really extraordinary work that is done by the International Medical Corps. I had the privilege of meeting a couple of the nurses working in Somalia and Dr. In the Bella Twain in Somalia where we were. And the dedication, working under the most difficult circumstances. And Jim saw even more than I did when you went on to Mogadishu. We had to leave the country at night. They, of course, stay. And I think that their dedication to wanting to assist in providing care and concern and stability is extraordinary. And I am very pleased that OFDA is recognizing the fine work done. As you say, it goes back a long way. And thank you, Nancy, on behalf of your representation of IMC.
I should have joined in thanking Ambassador Nachos, too. We appreciate your leadership.
Thank you. Okay. International Medical Corps would like to thank the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance for its support during this emergency in Somalia. Without OFDA's prompt response last year, the misery and the death suffered by the Somali people would have been considerably greater. The grant we have signed enables International Medical Corps to significantly expand its work treating the war wounded in new areas of fighting in southern Somalia, and also to begin a child care program in the central region. IMC hopes to expand its services, participating in a massive relief effort that we hope will come. The war in Somalia is beyond the experience of most of us. Armed soldiers with no armies, fighting with no battle lines, political factions with no concept of morality. And all the indications are that the trial of the Somali people is not over and that there is more to come. But the lack of aid is not due to a lack of desire on the part of donors like the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance and the willingness of organizations like International Medical Corps, and there are other groups there too, to carry out the work. As we know, aid workers have been routinely fired upon and several have lost their lives. We are willing to stay and we are willing to continue to help, but we do need help. The only alternative left is the deployment of armed humanitarian escorts to protect both aid workers and the relief effort. Armed escorts are needed to prevent heavily armed bandits from literally stealing food out of the mouths of starving children, to place those who rule by force on notice that there is a world community that cannot tolerate this outrage. Again, International Medical Corps supports all efforts to provide the security necessary to save the people of Somalia, and gratefully acknowledges the continuing support of the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, Andrew and Jim, and the efforts of eminent Americans like Senator Kassebaum and Senator Simon, who have focused world attention on this problem. We hope that the world community will respond. Thank you.
We have received word today that the UN has concluded an agreement with all the Somali warring factions, and that we'll be able to commence with the deployment of 500 armed security guards. But I think I would agree completely with Senator Simon that this is just a pause along the way to a comprehensive solution, and we all have a lot more work to do. With that, if we could move to the table, we'll sign the agreement with the International. Thank you very much. That concludes the ceremony. If there are questions from reporters, I think all the participants have agreed to take a question. Questions? Thank you.
That's an ICRC plan which we support. And the question is, that is going ahead, yes. In terms of the effort to secure other areas of the country, there are other measures that need to be taken. This is, as Jim Kunder and Senator Simon said, are just a first step. We're very pleased with the success that Ambassador Sunun has had, and we compliment him because it was very difficult to negotiate this under the circumstances, since the political leadership of the clans has been unwilling to even take this small step. So that's a good sign, but it's not enough, and there are measures that we are discussing right now. I just came from a meeting on that subject. We don't have announcements to make yet, but we will shortly.
If I could just add, you can get to the interior in isolated spots through helicopters, but that just small amounts can be delivered through helicopters. What you really need is to open these routes through to trucks. That's just essential.
I would just add that I was disappointed that the United Nations has said it will take 3 weeks before the 500 armed security personnel could get there and be on the ground. I personally would hope that maybe we could visit with the Secretary General and see if there is any possibility that that can be stepped up, because by 3 weeks a lot can happen.
Any further questions? Thank you.
That's a good idea. I think we should why don't we try and do that? Set up a conference call. Are you going to be here tomorrow? Yeah.
Take her someplace. Our grandson has a history of intrusive loss of bowel control. He has stated to his therapist that it doesn't happen when he doesn't have to see his other grandmother. He has stated several times that he doesn't want to visit with his father's family, yet the social worker says he does not know what he wants, and visits with his father's family continue to be ordered. The paternal side of the family, they have a very different way of raising their children than we raised our children. In our family, my sons and daughters did not fight or beat each other, nevertheless ever strike me. I mean, I would stand on a chair and beat him if I had to. Anyways, the children have always lived with us. They had their own bedroom, their own clothes, their own yard, and all through Barbara's marriage, Barbara, when she would leave to go with George, would call us from any place, and she knew 24 hours a day that we would be there if she ever needed us, and on many occasions, she needed us. Well, the hard part about this, and the terribly sad part about this whole thing, is not being recognized as a grandparent. We're not people. We're regarded as interfering, meddling. I don't know where they got the idea what we looked like, some kind of a bad person. Anyways, my husband is a very devoted, loving father, husband, grandfather. He loves his grandchildren. When I was placed on the witness stand day after day, cross-examined by 7 attorneys, my husband continued on with his business, but it tore him apart knowing I was on the witness stand. One day we were in the backyard and we come home, and my daughter thought my husband had been drinking and he couldn't make it up the stairs. And my daughter said, "Mom, something's wrong." And one side of him was paralyzed. So we brought him in the house and we took him to the hospital, and he had a stroke. He came home. We still owe this lawyer thousands and thousands of dollars. So my husband goes back to work and suffers a big stroke. So now the man is able to walk and talk and walk around the neighborhood, say hello to the people in the neighborhood, talk to children, and so forth. But his hands and his brain do not coordinate the same. His hand may be lifting up this water, but his brain thinks he's reading this paper. He's very harmless, but he's a very loving, kind, gentle man. After he had his strokes, the Department of Social Services zoomed down on us like hawks, wanted to know, was this good for the children to see after what they had already witnessed? They thought they should be taken out of this home and placed with younger candidates. Well, these children are very bonded to their grandfather, and they take care of their grandfather. They hold his hand, they walk down the street with him. They're proud of their grandfather. They're not ashamed of him. The younger Department of Social Service, the workers, don't know how to handle my husband's stroke, don't know how to handle me as a grandmother who can speak up and look them right in the eye and tell them what's what. They don't like that. So the Department of Social Service did such a horrible injustice by doing an intensive investigation into my family. The father's side of the family made a statement that I was a manic depressive, a child abuser, and a child molester. And from that point on, the father's brother thought he had the Department of Social Services in his court. So they started an investigation. And this is how this all started, with the Department of Social Service investigating to see if I was a fit grandparent to raise these children. So 4 years later, we have custody of our grandchildren. The children are in therapy. They're progressing quite well. By the way, my grandson scored 91 and 92 on his SAT in school, so he's doing great. So we're doing fine. The reason we're doing as well as we are right now today, that my husband and I are not divorced or separated, or he's not in an institution or I am not in an institution, is because of an article we wrote and read in AARP about grandparents raising grandchildren. So I came out of the closet and I looked out the window, so-called closet, and I said, you know, honey, I think there are other people out there doing the same thing as we are. Look at this article. So I called, and that was the best call I've ever made in my whole life. We went, we talked, and finally that was the first place my husband and I were allowed to tell our real story. From the time our daughter was murdered to the time both of us went to the motel room where she was murdered and cleaned it all up, washed the floors, washed the walls, cleaned that place immaculate, took all her belongings and brought them home. We were able to talk for the first time about this. We were able to cry. We were able to say, I hate that rotten man that killed our daughter. Because all the while in court, you're not allowed to show emotions. You must not cry. You must not get angry. You have to look at the judge and let him believe that you are in control. How the heck do you stay in control when your daughter was savagely stabbed to death in front of your grandchildren? And not only the death was horrible, but what she lived before she even died was just as horrible. But when we got to this grandparents group, we could tell all these things. We both cried. My husband and I, we cried. We told the story. We left that room new people. We walked out, we said hello to people, we smiled, and we became human beings again, grandparent human beings. Without that support group, without that way to vent, to talk about the problems, to say these kids are driving us crazy, what am I going to do with them? To say these things without worrying the social